the kind of contemplation a queer person has to go through to arrive at a state where they can accept that and know that about themselves and to actually be integrated as a person dealing with all of that, that's something that's extremely impressive. And I think every person should try to go through and figure themselves out in some of those same ways, those same pathways that queer people automatically have to go through. I think it's a beautiful roadmap for all of humanity, whether you're queer or not. I think that's a gift.
Welcome to Communion and Shalom.
In this podcast, we are exploring how the biblical and historic Christian faith can engage sexuality, ethnicity, culture, and our local communities as we pursue the flourishing of God's kingdom. Our goal is to engage these topics charitably and with nuance.
Hello, everybody. In our last episode with Will and Michelle, we dug into different ideas of what we or others might mean in describing ourselves as queer or talking about queering kind of cultural norms. Now we want to talk about kind of what does that look like for you not just to see queerness of whatever variety that may be, same-sex sexual attraction, as just a source of remorse, but also seeing the nuances around it, seeing where God has given you the capacity to bring good into this world. There's this particularly fun quote from W.H. Auden that I want to share. He says, "Though I believe it sinful to be queer, it has at least saved me from becoming a pillar of the establishment." And I think that's just such an interesting quote where he's like, he's wrestling with this reality that he's like, I have this sin in my life, where he was at different times in his life engaged in a homosexual sexual relationship that he, in his Christian faith, saw that way I'm engaging that relationship is sinful. But he's seeing that, there's something that me not being, straight has kept me from being, a pillar of the establishment. What are some of the ways that, TJ, I don't know if you want to throw in on ways that, I could just say, like, for myself, that I'm like, wow, I'm really thankful I'm gay. I'm really thankful that I do not just have the most normal heterosexual attractions, because of the way that it's caused me to question our culture's norms around marriage, around companionship. It's opened up to me to see, I've had to question and think about what really is marriage for, and not just to follow the scripts, as Will would say, the game. And it's made me be more reflective, because both in like, what's sin, what's righteousness, that doesn't mean I've just followed my inclinations in whatever way queer culture may want them to go, but I've been forced into this place of tension that has actually brought about a lot of source of joy in the ways that I've then intentionally cultivated my communities and my relationships and sought to live my life in faithfulness to God.
Amen. I would say for me, it's often been hard. It's been a struggle in a certain way, but it has been very generative as a Christian disciple. And part of that is kind of based on like the socio-political position of queer people in a lot of contexts in the contemporary world. I've seen what it means to have to be merciful to the marginalized, right? Because when I've seen myself be marginalized or others be marginalized who are queer, I realized, well, what's the call of the Christian disciple in this context? And that made me more merciful, made me more hospitable, made me more willing to fight for justice, like pursuing justice for people who actually suffer. And those are a few things about a socio-political position. I also like Aden's quote, in part because it reminds me that queer people, as you mentioned, can sometimes see beyond just the common way of doing things, right? Because in a lot of ways, we don't fit the common ways, at least in Christian contexts. We don't fit the common ways of trying to have a life, Marriage may not be our common path. And Aden's showing that at least I'm not a pillar of the establishment. At least I don't fall into the common dominant power structures that exist in this context. I also do want to mention, and this blurs a little bit into the question of like ontological inherent versus sociopolitical position. and I'll mention this, we talk about this later in the podcast, but potentially queer people, maybe a genius for friendship. There's something there, right? That could be inherent, especially if you take a definition of queer, where queer is a particular special orientation towards the same sex in some way.
That actually, I mentioned, I was reading just a few paragraphs out of Plato's Symposium where he's talking about the men who seem to be more drawn towards kind of partner together, bodily, sexually with other men, that those are the men who take higher positions in society, that they come in to have virtues of being really civilly engaged and helping run things in the city and the polis and the government.
And I kind of wonder, to go off that, I think this is just a guess, I'm not sure. I assume some of the celibate people in the medieval Europe were what we call queer now, right? And they often occupied priestly positions, right? Or they occupied secular priestly positions where they were involved in governance in some way, the bishops or whatever. And this is speculation, obviously, but I think there's something to what Plato's saying. Or even if queerness draws you to someone of the same sex, it's easier to form like public, alliances to accomplish certain endeavors. Whereas if you marry and have kids, a lot of your energy and time is hypothetically often engaged in that sort of endeavor,
Yeah. And even Plato himself you can tell he's in a dialogue because he said, some people call these men shameless in the way that they open themselves up to sexual relationships with other men, and particularly as to be tutored by other men, and that had in the pederastic sexual relationships. So there were people who were saying, "Oh no, this is shameful behavior." But he tries to then argue for what he notices going on in society. Well, these same men who are in what we might actually say is shameful, shameful behavior that doesn't fit into God's plan sexually, that yet there was still something notable about these types of people. And so can we draw our attention to those other notable features and not just the potential sinful connections as well?
Definitely. I've also been, in my Christian discipleship, I've had to become more humble. And I think humility is a great virtue in the Christian life, because I've realized what it is to struggle with sin. Yeah, struggle with sin and not know what to do. So maybe more humble, and part of this is mercy, but humble towards people who choose differently than I do, I guess, or who struggle even differently than I do. Because I see, you know what it is to struggle, right? So you can't have the same pride that I'm the righteous one who does all things right, or I have the best way of life, or I can easily just live a good life, because I've struggled. And I think there's something to that.
Do you mean that just in terms of struggling as a sinner, or struggling as even just navigating your way through life?
I mean, I would say both. Can I also throw another piece out there? I recently was watching, this was on Life on Side B, which is a Side B oriented podcast, podcast that also exists. And they were interviewing Misty Irons, who we recommended in a previous short episode for her talk at Revoice of last year, I think, 2021, right? And she mentioned that she often sees God in the margins, and the Holy Spirit is working in the margins, even when sometimes the dominant players in the church don't see or don't want to see, right? And I think queer people being in the margins, at least in this context, and a lot of contexts in the world right now, we see God working in ways that people may not expect, Like God is there, and God is blessing queer people, and He's blessing queer people's reflection, because we're actually trying to figure out something that's complicated, or that's not the dominant way, or a way that there's silences in the tradition, or there's ways they've glossed over some of these hard questions that we're trying to ask in our time, And we're asking these questions and contextualizing in our time what it means for doing this. And we're trying to resource from other times, other eras, other places, Christian tradition and not, to answer these questions. And I think of course, I'm positioned in a certain way, but I think the Holy Spirit's there. He's blessing. There's a blessing there, right, in this pursuit. And I'm thankful that I'm queer in that way, because I'm thankful that I'm part of this project of the kingdom, at least the way I see it, project of the kingdom, trying to determine what, faith-seeking understanding, determine, God, what is your path in this situation, in these circumstances that we live, And like, what do we do with it? What are the options? What can we imagine would be a faithful way for queer people to live?
Mm-hmm. And that really resonates, I mean, just with my heart for building community, that it's like, oh yeah, I care about for those who are on the margins, who are really feeling the lack of community, but I see how this is actually a huge need in the church at large, and that I've been given, more of a special gift, a special opportunity to bring that witness for the whole church. Yeah, so just that way that the Spirit is working on the margins and showing where he is desiring to work his redemption. As I'm excited for us to listen to this conversation with Will and Michelle in discussing these things more in depth, I want to make a quick note about our mixed feelings around the fact that there's a rising queer identification in our population, especially among the youth. While we really do see the Holy Spirit working on the margins in some special ways, Michelle kind of mentions it later, of like, every person is indeed special. Everyone is indeed gifted by God, by his Holy Spirit. And so while there are notable ways that we can see that happening among the quote-unquote queer community, while indeed there are special ways that we see that queer people might be gifted or positioned, I don't want any of our listeners to feel like they are unspecial if they're not queer. We want it to be an encouragement for people who do feel like they are queer. But if you aren't, or you end up realizing you're not as queer as you thought you were, that's fine. There's different ways that I sometimes feel that way. I'm like, I don't know if I'm as queer as maybe that other person. And that's fine, because that's not ultimately like what matters in it of itself, but it's what we see God doing in and through us. And we're just trying to name some of those ways that has happened in our lives with respect to queerness. So let us go back into the conversation with Will and Michelle. What are these ways that our experiences in, quote unquote queerness have opened us up or helped us, pursue goods or, bring about goods in our communities, that it's both valuable, I think, to say, hey, out of my particular experience, it maybe does relate to the way that I've engaged with queerness, but let's not let that create its own norm. Let's make sure to keep subverting that, that like kind of story that would overly force other people to think that, like, in order for you to bring goods into your community or to discover things about yourself, you must be queer. Because that's, I think, something that does happen at times in our culture, which is a bummer. But I won't get down that rabbit hole at the moment. But I'd be curious to hear just more. What are some of those particular ways you would say goods have emerged out of your experiences as queer people?
I would say just the kind of discernment that any queer person has to go through, I think, is something that everyone, other queer people and non-queer people alike, should look at and use as an example in their own lives as they're trying to connect with God and the people around them and themselves. I think it's really important. And it's something that's just inherent to queerness. Queer people are automatically living in a world that is the game. They're part of the game, as Will would say. Or they're not part of the game, excuse me. You're thrown in a world where everything points in one direction. And at some point, whether it's early on in your childhood or it's later on in life, you start to realize, like, no matter what I do, I cannot play by the rules of this game anymore. It's just not working. Maybe you're bisexual and, you have been able to blend in because you are experiencing attraction to the opposite gender, so everything seems normal from the outside, but like, you're still bisexual. There are still things that you have to think about that other people don't. You're still experiencing attraction to other people that are of the same sex. There's still all these different things that you have to think about. As an asexual person, I didn't think, I knew something was a little off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I thought maybe I'm a very closeted bisexual because I had never even considered the possibility of not being able to experience sexual attraction to other people. That wasn't something that was real. Even when people explained to me, oh, I'm asexual, this is how I experience the world, things just didn't click because I was so entrenched in the game. People experience sexual attraction, and I guess there's a couple gay people on the fringe, and they're over there, and we're over here. It was difficult to be able to put my experiences together, to be able to even comprehend that that might be a possibility for me. I was totally open to queerness. I had a lot of gay friends. I was all for it. It wasn't even like a homophobia response. It was just, this is how life is. So there is no possible way for my experience to not fit into that. So the kinds of self-exploration that a gay person or a queer person or someone that's not cisgendered has to go through to discover those things about themselves, has to go through to establish this is not a bad thing about me, even though it is queer. It's not normal. It's not what I see on TV. It's not what most of my friends might be growing up. It's not what my community, my parents, my church members are. It's still good. It's still something that gives gifts to the world. That's a very difficult thing to arrive at unless you have a lot of support, and most people don't. So the kind of contemplation a queer person has to go through to arrive at a state where they can accept that and know that about themselves, and to actually be integrated as a person dealing with all of that, that's something that's extremely impressive. And I think every person should try to go through and figure themselves out in some of those same ways, those same pathways that queer people automatically have to go through. I think it's a beautiful roadmap for all of humanity, whether you're queer or not. I think that's a gift.
Can I go off of that? Going through that process in general made my posture toward interpreting others or interpreting ideas, like being willing to appreciate complexity and nuance way more, and having the humility, like it grew my humility, like that virtue, that I could be humble enough to understand just people's complexity in figuring out certain things about themselves, and to actually realize that something can have both eat disorders and goods, or evils and goods, or like it's not so simple as just that's bad, that's good, but you can actually provide like more reflective evaluations of situations at hand. And kind of, Michelle, what you're saying, that process that really changed my framework, like my models of interpreting the world, having to go through that process myself. Or again, as you said, or as Will said, you're not like the game. The game is different. The cultural scripts are not yours. It produces that humility. It produces that complexity that as you engage the world. So,
yeah, I think kind of what you both are saying. I think that the one of the gifts and unique things of queerness is that gift of being able to discern. Right? So many like gay friends that I have, even if they haven't studied these things officially, are kind of like their own little theologians, or like therapists or sociologists or theorists. And then many of them, for some reason, like, I wonder why this could be, you know, a lot of them do end up pursuing like higher ed. Like I know so many queer people who are like either licensed therapists or getting degrees in like clinical mental health counseling. Why is that? You know, but I also think that I think there's something very special about that lived sense of discernment. Like you're not doing it in abstraction. You're doing it in a lived way. And it's often about your own self. So in some ways, the one kind of person you can be the most honest with is yourself. But also in some other ways, you're your own worst critic and not always good at discerning things about your own being, right? So it's like, as you're trying to make sense of sexuality or morality or sexual ethics or Christianity or any kind of religion or spirituality, like it really hits home because it has something to do with you. You know, it isn't just something you're deciding about other people out there. It's something that you have to live into. And I think it's that living into a thing and not just say studying a thing. And like, I'm not trying to like gatekeep our straight allies from like talking about this stuff, but there really is a different thing about having to go through it yourself, walking in your own shoes. And then when you can, like you were saying, TJ, when you can take that and then extrapolate that to others, like that is such a gift. Again, because you yourself have had to throw away that script. You can now see when someone else does something from your perspective, something kind of queer. Well, I wouldn't have done it that way. Well, I wouldn't have followed that particular theology. Well, I wouldn't have, picked up this belief or that belief. Well, sure. But scripts are powerful, right? The game has very, very, very strong rules and very, very strong scorekeepers and very, very, very outrageous punishments for people that break those norms, right? Whether that's just like bullying and name calling, the kinds of terms that people throw around like slurs, or actual like hate crimes. There's a whole lot at stake if you don't play the game. But in some ways, I think that is such a good preparation for asceticism and for martyrdom, right?
Yes.
Giving up yourself to learn these things, sometimes not because of your own choosing, is practice for the Christian walk. Right? If you've endured persecution because you care a little bit more about people, you're willing to be a little bit more generous, or people were pointing out, girls or guys, and you're like, I don't really understand that, and people make fun of you. You're learning what it's like to have to endure. Then as you get older, you start to step into that for your own self. Like, it isn't just like downloaded belief. It becomes a learned and embodied belief. And not everybody has the opportunity to do that. And again, this isn't to like speak down to our straight friends, but like when you're playing by the rules of the game and the game is made for you, it's a little bit harder to step out of that world and accept someone else's different viewpoint on things. But as queer people, we've got a whole lot of practice in doing that.
I often, when I think about that, I sometimes talk about, I think being queer made me more merciful over time, or more hospitable over time, because I had to live a certain life. And like at different times in my life, in different contexts, I've been like marginalized or made an outcast or pariah because I was queer. Like if queer people are oppressed in your context, you have a different experience of being queer, and that may produce different virtues sometimes, right? Like I mentioned, I become more merciful, I think, as a Christian disciple because I've been queer and I've seen people oppress myself or people like me. So maybe want to be more merciful in general to people who struggle to fit in. But I don't know, it's that the process of discipleship, those steps you take on that path, I think they definitely are the seed beds of the virtue of mercy or the virtue of hospitality. And I can always appreciate that. I've also been in contexts where being queer is like not commented on, or it's like not realized or something. So, I mean, maybe those people who are in that context don't experience that same sort of growth of mercy and hospitality, but it definitely, I think, can be there if you're in contexts where you're marginalized in some way.
Yeah, for sure.
And even as we've been calling it, the game of just like not having the cultural goods as readily accessible to you, even if people aren't like commenting directly on it, though, usually they'll be like, well, some sweet old lady at church will be like, so are you dating anybody right now?
Oh, yeah.
And, now I'm just like, nah, I'm really content being single. It helps just the line of like, oh yeah, what are the goods that I'm seeking? Marriage is a good, but it's not the ultimate good. And that ready to sacrifice, in a sense, the easy approval of others for you checking the boxes along the way. Going to the first revoice, one of the most just beautiful things was, and that first revoice, I think, was particularly mostly represented by gay men and same-sex attracted men, and was everybody singing "It Is Well," just really loudly in this old historic church. It is well. It is well. Like whatever waves of suffering may come. The lyrics I'm blanking on right now, but the just classic hymn, and you could just see them. These are people who have endured loss and who are struggling in a lot of different ways, but they're holding on to Christ as their anchor and are able to say, it is well. And that note of sacrifice, I think, is just so critical to the Christian journey. Like, if there is no sacrifice in our life, we will not know Christ, because we so often meet him in his sufferings through our own sufferings, through our own denying, sometimes good, sometimes deceitful things from the world, but it's in that denial that we find Christ meeting us.
I was just thinking about how how suffering in some ways is sort of like a great equalizer. So even for people that aren't unfairly persecuted, they understand suffering through the effects of sin, right? But again, it's like that's where I think so much of being a Christ follower is helpful in learning how to be a good human to other humans. You know, I think so much of this in the Anglican liturgy, there's a part where there's a corporate confession. So everyone together in unison confesses their sins, and then there's a proclamation of absolution, and that's all done together. But what's awesome is no matter what anyone in there is confessing, right? Maybe someone's confessed like, I don't know, I kind of was a little bit snippy to a cashier. Maybe someone else is like, I laundered money. They all together corporately confess the sins. And together they hear, in some forms of Anglican liturgy, the comfortable words, which is where the minister turns around and says, hear what comfortable words our Savior Jesus Christ tells us. Come to me, all you who travail and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, for my burden is easy, my yoke is light. Everyone hears those words together. Again, it's this coming to Christ that is a great equalizer. And I think we become ministers of that equalizing through our queerness, because we've deeply embodied what it's like to be cast aside, to be pushed off, right? Now, someone who is, straight or whatever, I think if they focus on their sin, they can kind of realize, yep, we're all kind of in this spot where we have something happening to us that isn't great, right? But, queer people in one form or another probably understand, yep, this isn't great to be where I'm at, whether, again, because if it's teasing or something as crazy as hate crimes or things like that. They're very, very aware of their state in life. Something is broken, right? The game doesn't work for me. Whatever it is that helps someone realize that. When you're able to come to the world as, hey, I'm just another human, right? I'm not someone who is, I earned my degree from this school. I make this much money. That's not who I am. No, who I am is someone who is designed and made for connection with others, with God, with community, with a story, with myth, with worship, whatever those things are. That openness to connectivity, I think, is the first step in so many ways, right? Maybe a 12-step program would tell us that. Maybe Christianity would tell us that. Maybe other religions would tell us that. But I think, again, as queer people, we have this special connection to that because in some ways, like a gift, it's been just presented to us whether or not we wanted to accept it. But we get to take from that the experiences that come with needing to understand this radical openness to ourselves and to others.
Another good that I've considered, and this is from the, Episcopalian theologian Wesley Hill. In one of his books, I think Spiritual Friendship, he makes it's not offhanded comment, but he just throws in, maybe queer people have a special genius for friendship with people of their own sex, right? Like that's the basic point of the premise. I'm curious, Will and Michelle, what do you guys think about that as kind of asexual people? I assume you would also track with that, but perhaps not. And then kind of as a flip side of that, and this is especially from David Frank, he's mentioned this in the past. Sometimes he's been in situations where when he's with a woman, as a queer, same-sex attracted man, the sexual energy is low or not really there. So it changes the dynamic of the relationship in that they're not part of the game, as you might say. Well, yeah, like it's not that game like, you're trying to date me, or like that sexual energy is coming from you. It's a different dynamic in the relationship sometimes. More sisterly, maybe, you might say. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But yeah, what do you guys think about both of those ideas as gifts of potential being queer?
No, I think honestly what you've said there, you've taken the words right out of my mouth, TJ. I think that's one of the greatest gifts. One of the things that I've for myself wanted to be is just a safe person. That's just sort of like a goal of mine. But it is really cool because even though, I'm sorry, straight people listening to this, I'm going to make a little joke at your expense. We all know of a lot of straight people who are like, oh, I can always tell my gaydar is so good. And often it's the people that say that have like terrible, terrible gaydars and they can never tell actually. But even with straight friends who don't know that I'm queer, but also aren't like picking up that I'm queer, they're able to clock something. And you're totally right. There is something more of that kind of sisterly, safe thing. So you can get away with, and I mean it that way, I'm saying it that way on purpose, you can get away with being more open in your friendship because they're not sensing this kind of heterosexual sexual energy from you. right?
Yeah.
They're not thinking when you're saying something. They're not viewing like you're trying to get in their pants or something like that. Like there's just something about your spirit, the vibe, that there's a vibe of just not potentially becoming a weird reply guy or something like that. Like I said, it's a funny dynamic because I've had it happen more than once where like clearly I'm inside someone's safe zone, but they're still like, oh, like you should date my friend who's a woman. And it's like, you got something right here and also something terribly wrong.
For me, I feel like I'm probably a lot more straight passing than Will is. But even when I've told people, it hasn't always had an effect. I've told men before, oh, I'm asexual. And their response is, oh, don't worry, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Like, no bridge to cross. We are not crossing any bridge here. But I feel like it hasn't been taken as seriously, maybe because women are, seen as less sexual already. We're already almost seen as asexual beings. Anyways, like something to be pursued. It is a conquest. And then magically you marry them and suddenly they're sexual, I suppose, within purity culture. But I haven't ever really noticed that. I've definitely gotten a lot of people that, like, when I get close to them, they're like, oh, I feel so safe. I feel like I can tell you things I couldn't tell other people, that kind of thing that I felt like came from more of a queer experience. But it was never quite what Will has experienced. And I'm extremely jealous of that. I crave that for myself. I don't want to be perceived in the way that, that signifies that I'm playing the game, because I'm not. But it feels like no matter how I intend to portray myself or even what I say, I am still immersed in the game.
I think part of that comes out of the kind of Western history that has formed itself into this toxic masculinity, that there's just a sharper contrast, that it kind of makes it easier to stand out as a guy at times. Just like, hey, we can like talk about our emotions and like be close with other people and not be like afraid of it somehow hurting our sense of, manliness, that like, outside of the sexual intimacy. But it's like, yeah, we can just like, it's chill.
I think women already get a lot of those benefits. They already get to have those close, intimate relationships. I could at any point have cuddled with any of my female friends, even if we weren't super close. It was just, it's intimacy. It's fine. It's not, but no homo, it is.
Yeah.
And I'm very appreciative that women have gotten to experience that kind of openness to each other that men, gay or straight or otherwise, should be able to, as human beings, should be able to experience. And I think it's very sad that they don't get the feminine friendship experience. Perhaps I already get all the benefits of being queer as a woman, but it is a different experience.
It helps highlight the question to me of, and I don't know how important it is always to identify this, or whether you could ever really distinguish it, but this like, oh, how much of this, these goods that are coming from our queer experiences are truly just this like social positional, just like we come out of a society that does XYZ and we are queering that norm and experiencing what has always been meant to happen.
Yes.
Versus something that maybe if, let's say, men and women were already great at making all these brotherly, sisterly relationships within the sexes and across the sexes, would there still be this like subsection of the population that we might code as, queer in some way, that are less oriented towards heterosexual marriages and procreation, and they're like, oh, and they still go above and beyond and have like a special genius of making friendships. Maybe I'm open to that. It's definitely easier to see when there's just this, or like deep trench in society that we're like climbing out of.
Yeah, I mean, historically, right, lots of different cultures have found special ways to appreciate, say, trans people, for instance. Kind of like you're saying, even in cultures where it was a little bit less hard-coded about like toxic masculinity, you better, get Jane's oil and mow the grass and chop wood or whatever. So even in cultures where it was a little less that, where everybody was hunting and gathering, right? Even then there was a special appreciation for people that were different, odd, queer, we might kind of anachronistically say. But in some ways, again, like there is something kind of like you're saying, David, I think there's something heavenly about that, right? That we can look at different people and find different interesting and unique things about them, because ultimately we'd understand that there is something beautiful about who they are specifically, whether or not they're queer. Even if they're straight, they're interesting, right? But I mean, because think about this, right? Even within the 12 apostles, there was still an inner circle. Even through all the people that followed Christ, there was still Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, right? There's whatever it was. It's hard to know these things because humans have different things about them and different things that click and connect. There was something special and unique about those relationships. And so I think that there's something about the queerness that we have that breaks us, maybe in some ways something that becomes too much of individuality. There is something definitely in our culture fueled by consumerism, fueled by brands, fueled by platform building and this thing and that thing that is very anti-human. And in some ways, anti the individual person, the human behind so many of these things. We've become turned into numbers, reified, because we're marketing data. We've been turned into clicks and comments and likes and stats and analytics and data science. And there's something about queerness, I think, that, and you could, again, turn this into something like a critique of everyone's a special snowflake, but there's something about the heart behind that, the fundamental yes that we could say to that I think is very, very Christian, right? As people who are called by God, it isn't just the group that's called by God, even though the church is called by God corporately. Like each of us has our name written in the book of life, some special name that no one knows, whatever that means, right? But there's something special about each and every one of us. We believe that we can connect with other people in special ways, just like Jesus connected specially with Lazarus or with John. There's something special to those relationships. And there's something maybe sometimes a little bit queer about those relationships. If you've ever had friends of the same sex that you've been really close to, and maybe you've gotten weird looks or something like that because you're so close. Or maybe a close friend of the opposite sex that people would expect to feel some sort of sexual tension, but there's not because you're gay, and there's just something that throws people off. I think it's very Christian to live in the world in such a way that throws people off. That's a little bit weird. I think it's very Christian, right? When Paul goes to Mars Hill and he says, "Oh, there's this unknown God here," and he just starts talking. Obviously, there people did just have these open air conversations, but then Paul is like talking about the resurrection, and then it says just before that people wanted to hear some new thing. So even Paul's style of even just the content at the bare minimum was a little bit queer, a little bit different. The way that he goes about it is so weird. I'm going to answer for you the unknown God. But again, as queer Christians, we can do that for people, right? It's like, maybe let's say that there is sort of this false idol of the special snowflake, but we know of that unknown God behind the special snowflake, right? There's actually something deeply spiritual about the unknown God and something deeply spiritual about a special snowflake mentality. Both of those lead us to the divine God who loves each and every one of us individually, specially, personally, right? That's in there, right? That's Christian. And I think for a lot of people out there that are hearing nasty, icky things from Christians, to hear a Christian say to them, "I agree with you. I agree with you on that," right? Think about how Paul could have gone there. "Ew, all of these gods. Ew, that's so bad," right? No, he's like, "I see that you are a deeply spiritual people. In fact, there's this idol there to an unknown God that's so spiritual. You don't want to miss any of them," right? Paul engages in this yes saying. He's not an anti, he is yes saying. And I think there's so much about queer culture that, again, it's heavenly. It's not something we have to like kind of proselytize and baptize and like redeem as if it's like so horrible and broken and it's just poisoned until we as Christians come along and fix it. No. As human beings designed for liturgy, for worship, that's going to be built into the things that we do. Because we're made for worship, because we're made to desire bigger things, that's going to come across in every community, especially ones that are marginalized, because they're going to go back to their roots. The roots of all human culture is that kind of religious impulse. So there's a lot of religious, in some way, echoing through minority movements.
I'm wondering, can we talk a little bit more about how a queer perspective destabilizes, deconstructs, subverts, or reinforces a lot of cultural communities' emphasis on marriage and romance. And I just ask because it may seem obvious to us, maybe, but a lot of my straight friends or like people in my communities, they wonder because they value marriage and or the way that romance is constructed to be part of marriage and like contemporary marriage norms. They value it so highly. How does being queer relate to that? Show different goods, deconstruct what is on offer typically?
I think one way that it does that is it's great when there's marriage. That's a beautiful, communion of two people. God is watching. It's a unification, but there has to be this deep friendship with that as well. And I think that's something that queer people really bring to the table with that is I think a lot of queer people are seeking this deep intimacy, especially within like side B communities where marriage is not always offered for them. They are seeking a larger community. They're seeking, maybe celibate partnerships with people. What is very, very important to them is their relationship with Christ and also the relationship to the people around them. I don't think that view is taking down marriage or anything like that. But I think there's a lot to be learned from the ways that queer people pursue intimacy in their lives that other people can pick up in their own marriages and outside of their marriages, and how they're continuing to maintain their community outside of their marriage. How, maybe they shouldn't go off with their husband or wife and no longer be an integral part of their community because they have each other. I think the way queer people kind of look at that often is a much broader community, and there's importance in that. And I think that is also like reflectant of what it's going to be like in heaven. We're not just going to have one singular person. We're going to have communion with everyone, and we're going to know God better through that. And obviously you learn so much about God through a marriage, but you also learn so much about him through maintaining a beautiful and healthy relationship with the people around you. You can't just be an island with it.
Yeah, that's a beautiful, I think, example, Michelle, of how the experience queerness/singleness is both subverting a lot of cultural expectations with marriage, and again, then re-bringing it back into its more designed context. Marriage was always meant to be part of a community. It is to be not only, it creates community and through procreation, it's also not ex nihilo. It also was embedded within a network where there's mutual support that happens in a much more complex network. And I don't know, just that often I experience that subversion unto the point of like re-edifying it, re-strengthening it to be really what it's supposed to be, or how it can be healthier, not on that like friendship note of some people depend on their spouse kind of as like their only friend, their only intimate. And that puts so much stress on marriage. And where it's like, oh, I don't have a married spouse. I'm not depending on, I'm not looking to date in order to try to find that person so that I can do that. I say, well, how else can I build this into my life? And then I like, oh, my married friends really need that too. How can I be that friend to them too, so that they're not lonely or putting too much pressure on their spouse?
Yeah, I think that kind of culture almost creates holes that we feel like we need to fill. Like, I need a girlfriend and we need to be married here around this time before I'm, such and such age. And she needs to be, she needs to have this personality. And like, my mom wants her to be able to cook for me. And I think that she should be able to do this. And we have all these expectations for someone that we haven't even met yet. And this perhaps shouldn't be so much a hole to fill that we've already created and casted the hole for, but a intimate relationship with one person that you get to know, and the whole should be created around them and your budding relationship as you learn about yourselves through that and learn about each other. And the whole should be able to shift in its shape over time as your relationship changes. I think having a community and getting to know people in that sort of way allows the whole to change shapes and for you to be receptive to that. Whereas if you have this expectation of, me and my future spouse are going to be married, and this is going to be my number one best friend and my support system, and everyone else is going to be, subpar compared to them, you're going to have a very well-structured whole. They're going to have to meet all these expectations because you do need to get that from somewhere. The problem is it just should not all be from your spouse. And I think that's a beautiful thing that the queer focus on community has to contribute to these more normative views of marriage. I don't know, just growing up in the church, I have known a lot of people who have had, in my opinion, pretty weird views on what marriage should be. I had a friend who recently tried to date a guy, and he had immediate expectations for okay, we should be boyfriend, girlfriend within 4 dates. If not, then it's not going fast enough. And after that, we need to be married within a year or else it's not meeting it. And I was like, whoa, he's known you for 2 weeks. Is that representative of you and your relationship, or is that representative of the hole that he wants to fit you in? You are better than that. You're not a peg to be filled in a hole with. You are beautiful and you are unique and you're a child of God that is not something to be shoved into someone else's hole of expectations that they have created without you.
Yeah, just thinking about what is it that we can do to queer that relationship? I mean, in some ways, Christ already does that, right? He is a celibate, single human being, right?
Yeah.
Who lives and dies and then now has, early release resurrection body, but he's fully God and fully man, as we know from, the church's historic teaching. Fully, right? Fully human. I think that's kind of what we're called to do by putting a pebble in people's shoes, by just being queer, by being who we are, right? When we find creative ways of being able to connect with people that aren't just in this kind of siloed view of man and woman, husband and wife, but in this truly. And this isn't to speak down on marriage, but I don't want to speak any higher or lower of marriage than Paul did, right? I desire people to be like me, single. It's the better state to be in. He literally says that. That's Bible, right? That's Bible. I thought we cared about that. He says it's better. Again, Jesus kind of proves that for us too. I don't want to apologize for the goods that Paul seems to be claiming from that. Now, even if you take Paul to be saying, okay, well, the second coming of Christ is going to happen in his lifetime, and that's why it's better. Okay, fine. Even so, life is still short, right? Mm-hmm. One way or another, whether it's because of economic collapse or just because any of us could get in a car accident tomorrow. Life is short. We better hurry on trying to show people the love of God. One way or another, that's still a core message of Paul that I think any of us can understand, no matter what our interpretation is on what exactly he means by that. But again, that's sort of a queering, isn't it? Right? True. Especially in a society that Paul is speaking to, where you couldn't own property or make a whole bunch of money just as a woman. But Paul is speaking to women just as much as he is to men. For them to be called to not getting married, to being single, to serving the church. But you notice that throughout Paul's whole life. Who are the people that he often plants these churches with? It's these kind of entrepreneurial women. Well, why is it that those people multiple times throughout the book of Acts have this weird position both in society and in just kind of personal flexibility to do that? Maybe there's something a little bit queer about them, right? The way of living your world in such a way, not just that you have financial flexibility, but you're the kind of person that other people are drawn to, or again, you live into that asceticism, that giving, that selflessness, like Lydia was. I think that's who Peter heals, right? I think that's the kind of sort of weird thing that we get to show other people, that openness that we can project people towards by showing a creative, different way of living. No. Marriage is not going to solve all of your problems. It's a holy thing. It can be a healthy thing, but it also isn't permanent, right?
Yes.
In the future state, they are neither married nor given in marriage. Some people's works, to connect this with another thought, some people's works are wood, hay, and stubble, and some people are precious stones. And again, draw whatever conclusions you want from that. But I know that one thing will last in the world to come, and that's going to be our communities that we build. And again, you can get caught up in that little individual microcosm and miss the forest for the trees. Yes, marriage is a microcosm of the church. Of course it is. But don't forget, as Paul says at the end of Ephesians, I'm actually really just talking about the church. I've said all of this stuff about marriage, it's a great mystery, but I'm really actually talking about something much, 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 much more important. Christ and the church. That's the point of marriage. It's just an example. And again, I mean that in the nicest possible way, but that it's just an example.
And that's where I feel like my kind of having to like dive deep into like, what is marriage? What does it mean to be, for man and women? And I feel like I've had to look into this more in part, especially probably like defending a side B position of like, okay, I have to ask these questions of the scriptures because I have same-sex attraction. And as I dig down deeper, like there's just more questions that come out like, okay, like I really believe that, then I gotta believe that deeply. I gotta know what it means. And in some ways, by queerly standing aside from the cultural scripts with marriage and de-idolizing it from where people have put it on a pedestal, that I've actually ended up becoming more traditionalist than most American evangelicals and affirm heteronormativity in a way that most of America doesn't, even if they're more heteronormative in other ways. That it's like, no, I actually believe that this difference between the male and female is especially God-designed chemistry and relationship that is also a pointer to this like divine and created like coming together and having this unique relationship that the marriage supper of the Lamb is, like one kind of version of that kind of taking place, or one way of that being expressed. And so I I actually see that as something really special, something about this hetero. I don't want to destroy, the categories of male and female, but I think it's God's design and it's good. And also the reproduction of the entire, human species designs on there being some heteronormative sexual orientations going on in sexual relationships, even though Christ is not primarily concerned with biological reproduction. He's like, that's a good, care for your kin, care for your, cousins, for your children, do that if that's what you're doing. But the kingdom I'm building is not dependent on that. He's not destroying his own creation that he loved and designed, but he's raising it up to something more than what we can put in our own hands.
One thing that I've gone through a similar journey to what you're describing, David Frank. And when I talk about it with my straight friends, these are mostly straight friends in the US, okay? I'm basically trying to convince them that marriage is more normed by childbearing and education of children than they realize, because typically I don't know if they had like a romantic view, like marriage is finding my soulmate that I just have pleasure with all the time or something. And maybe kids are like an accessory to our relationship sometimes. It's something more like that, even though I don't know if they would say in those words. But then when sometimes they've shifted to norm it more by children as more like a normal part of what marriage is for in this current age. But then they start to talk in terms like marriage is for the continuation of family. And I don't like that formulation because, of course, having children is an important, like, part of physical reproduction of the human species. Check. Having children is that. But I think side B can show us in part, not just side B only, but building family is more than just having children. Like, for example, there's covenant brotherhoods, there's joining lay monastic orders, there's joining monasteries, there's godparenthood, which is, of course, related to children. That's another Christian kinship form. There's also celibate partnerships. I mean, like there's a lot of ways that Christians have attempted to build family that are not directly about bearing children, even though, of course, it's related because human beings are increasing their number through having children on Earth in this age. So I don't know. I think side B helped me see that, just resist even just connecting family only towards marriage, right? Marriage is an important part of family, like physical reproduction, but it's not the only way of forming kinship in Christian terms.
Right.
So I don't know. That's some sort of other deconstruction that I think queer people, side B, can help people see.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I think I love how you said that, TJ. It's like, I think LGBT people in total can help people see that. But I think there's something that, like you're mentioning, you know, as folks who are side B and proud of that, there is still, I think, within the wider LGBT movement that everything is about marriage. And I understand why. I get it. I'm not arguing about that or the strategy, but like, great, awesome. But there's still this kind of lingering thing that I think needs to be queered, right? Too much has been borrowed from the straights, you know, in terms of this idolatrous placement of marriage. But I mean, I think that's the beauty, right? Like, what is true life for the Christian? I mean, this is what Jesus tells the Samaritan woman about. This is what he tells Nicodemus about. It's to be born again, right? The most true way that I am born, was born, am continuing to be born, was not when my first birthday was. My actual true birth started when Christ's side was pierced, and out came from his wound/womb blood and water, the amniotic fluid of salvation. That was my birth. You know, Christ is for me and this is biblical language too, the progenitor of my birth. Christ bore me out of the blood and water out of his body. That's how I became born. And it's like, so in just like this way, it's like, there's more to family than just a husband and a wife getting married, right? There's more to birth than just a baby coming out of a birth canal, right? In this Christian terminology, there's always this other layer, both below and above that if we don't see that, we're missing it. In the same way that, right, like, and I've heard other people say this a lot, but like, it isn't a Christian marriage just to have a heterosexual man and a heterosexual woman get married, contrary to what you might hear. No. A Christian marriage is this: when somebody loves the other person as Christ loved the church. That's a Christian marriage, right? And so that's the thing. You see a lot of people defending, not to get political there, but about like the sanctity of marriage. And then you hear about these people's personal lives, right? You know, you had like Josh Duggar running like the Family Research Council or something like that. And then we see what he was doing. It's like, that's not traditional family. Family is Christ loving the mystical body, right? Christ had a physical human man body. I have a physical human man body, and I am the bride of Christ. Queer. You see what I'm saying? But again, in Christian terms, everything is like that. Everything's a little bit different than you might have expected. But again, that's the story of salvation to begin with. We would expect nothing less.
I think similar experience that I've actually experienced is around men and women living together in the same household.
Yeah, you might know about that.
Living in a community house. I remember when I was younger, I'd be like, what? Like, that's so, like basically immoral for men and women to live in the same house. And now I just forget that like even was in my mind and might be in other people's minds, because it's just so normal for me to live with other guys and women with various straight and non-straight, sexual attractions, though pros and cons that come with all of it. And just the like, it would have been easy to say, oh, that's bad to put men and women together in the same household. And it's like, well, when you're mature enough and you have some care and wisdom and you know what you're building or planting, you can think about some of the actual really goods that happen when you have brothers and sisters living together. But if you do it wrong, you could be causing some pain.
Yeah, I agree.
Can I say one more thing? I'm so happy we had this conversation, because this was one of the key questions that we heard from some of our listeners. What are the goods to being queer? Because I think a lot of them are Protestant. So in a lot of Protestant spaces, it's mostly just seen as brokenness or disorderedness or something thereof. So I'm hoping, I also hope that conversation can continue, because when all you hear is that God may love you, but you have this notable problem, notable evil, notable disorder, like whatever trope people are using to describe yourselves, it can really turn you against the love of God, that you don't see his tenderness anymore. You don't see his possibility for you. You don't see the cultural scripts that are available for you to live a life that's good or flourishing, or, those things. So I also hope that conversation can continue.
No, I think you're right, though. But just as David was saying, it's all about taking people to the face of Christ, right? It's all about taking people to that spot where they can see themselves as God sees them, which, like I mentioned, that whole Ignatian thing is about that. It's not a matter of looking in the mirror and seeing yourself with your own eyes. This is very phenomenological, right? But rather putting Jesus's eyes in our eyeballs and looking back and seeing through Christ's eyes ourself. And in that way, seeing an image of Christ in ourselves. And I think there's some part of us that reacts to, oh, the culture is so everybody gets a participation medal, blah, 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 that we've almost reacted against this Christian principle of looking at ourselves in the mirror and saying, thanks be to God, I'm a son or daughter of the Father. Christ has redeemed me, and I can look in the mirror and see beauty. I can see something that is meant for eternity. Like, that's who I am, right? And again, that's real openness against false self-confidence, against like beauty products and like whatever they're selling on TikTok, right? It's about seeing with real eyes. And I think that is like ultimately where that humanness comes back into it. Like to see not through a mirror dimly or darkly, but as things truly are, right? To grow up in that sense, as Paul talks about.
Amen. Thank you, listeners, for joining with us on a lot of this verbal processing and connecting with each other and learning and listening and exploring as we try to answer this somewhat simple but extremely complex question. I hope that for those who are very comfortable with queering, that this has added some depth to kind of your, like, what are the ends of queering? What are the purposes here? And for those who still have a kind of gut reaction towards the word queer, that maybe this has softened you up a little bit to that it's not just a destructive force, but can be, really maybe you can categorize that word a little differently now. So that's all for now. Thanks so much, Will, Michelle, and TJ. This was good.
Thanks, TJ. Thanks, David. You all are just beautiful gems. Thanks so much for this work that you do in serving the church.
Thank you.
Hey, listeners, I want to let you know about the Communion and Shalom Patreon. Joining the Patreon community not only supports this podcast, but gives you the opportunity to listen to bonus content, give input on future episodes, and submit questions for a patron-only Q&A. We're so thankful for the support and encouragement from so many listeners, and we hope that this podcast continues to be meaningful to you.